Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Helping STEM Students Thrive session. My name is Patrice Prusco. I'm the Associate Director of Learning Design at the Teaching and Learning Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And this is the third year that we have been doing this series in collaboration with the University at Buffalo STEM Collaborative. And this year's theme, we're focusing on different types of learning pathways. So in October, we looked at community college. In November, new models of learning. In January, fully online programs. And this month, our focus will be on undergraduate students in STEM. And we'll be wrapping up this season in March with a focus on graduate students. We do have recordings of all of the previous sessions this year, and this one, just to let you know, this one also is being recorded. The Women in STEM Cooperative, just to tell you a little bit about that, consists of a group of volunteers who are dedicated to advancing women in STEM in our respective communities at the University at Buffalo and at Harvard. This series is our attempt to address some of the systemic challenges and opportunities with improving student STEM success. Before we invite today's distinguished panel, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about our guests. So far, we have registered over 140 colleagues that represent 56 institutions of higher ed and 8 other types of organizations. People come from 4 countries, 1 territory, and 25 states. If you are joining us today, I put a little note in the chat room, but please take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself and share any challenges or barriers that you're facing, as well as something that you would be interested in learning a little more about. In addition to sharing out knowledge, one of our goals for this series is to provide you a space where you can get to know other people in the field, develop relationships, and build a community of practice. And so with that in mind, we encourage you to take advantage of the chat box and talk with other people who are here at the session today. We will also have some time for Q&A, and during that time, we encourage you to turn your microphone on and ask your questions directly to our guests. So now a little bit about our guests today. We will be starting with Jean Christman, who is an associate professor, associate department chair at the Computer Engineering Technology at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and she'll be discussing issues that continue to create barriers for women in engineering. Mays Ahmad is a professor in the Department of Life and Physical Science and coordinator of the Teaching and Learning Center at Pima Community College, and she will be sharing her story as a graduate student and how that has informed her approach to teaching and her work around re-examining the reasons for the persistent gender and underrepresented minorities in STEM. And we'll be wrapping up with Sarah Bunnell, Associate Director for the Center for Teaching and Learning, STEM Specialist at Amherst College, and her research focuses on the development of metacognition and in developing effective classroom teaching practices. And so now I would like to turn it over to Jean, and we will start our discussion with her today.
Great, thank you.
So welcome, Jean. It's great to have you here with us today. And when we spoke, you shared your story of returning to school to get your PhD in engineering education. Could you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to pursue that line of research and how it has informed your current work?
Sure. So engineering is really behind some of the other sciences in their realization of what needs to be done to increase diversity. So originally I went back for the PhD in STEM education, really to help all my students. So I was noticing the thing about higher ed is that we have no training as teachers, and so all we fall back on is how we were taught or how we learned when we were in college. And I was realizing that those methods weren't working anymore. And it's a new generation of students. So I started back because I really did want to become a more effective engineering instructor. But in the course of that, I learned about equity and diversity and privilege and things along that nature. So that really drove the direction of my dissertation. And in the process of writing the dissertation, I came to the startling discovery that I, even as a woman, even as the person who started an organization for women in engineering, that I was so enculturated that even my classroom practices were part of this culture that was excluding women. And I think that was the biggest thing that came out of my whole schooling and dissertation, is the whole socialization process that leads those of us who, even though we feel we're working towards equity, we're so enculturated we don't see that we've become part of the problem. So that's really informed my work more than anything. And then whatever we do in changing our teaching to be more inclusive, for whether it's for our Alana students or for our women students, and that really helps all students. So, so in my original intention was to go to school to help all my students. I focused on diversity, and now I'm back to making those changes, and I believe all students will benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that all students do benefit, whether we're talking about diversity efforts, accessibility, and all of those things. So now you're in your current role. I was wondering if you could tell us, a little bit more about your current role, and how you became involved in thinking about reimagining the engineering curriculum. I read an article online about that, and we would love to hear a little bit more about that work and what drives that work.
Okay, so before I started my PhD, which was in 2013, the work I did mostly was around creating a community for women. And for years that everyone believed that that was the solution. If women just had a community, if women just had a safe space. And we did that for years and years and years and did not see an increase in the number of women. And so as I focused more on the culture of engineering education, it became apparent that no amount of community is going to overcome some of the just the long-standing traditions in engineering education so for example, engineering, it's always been touted as problem solving. And if you look into it, most of the problem solving that I observed in classrooms is really just a list of problems with no real application. And so in talking to women and minority students, they really want to know the application of what they're doing. So some of the things, like taking real world applications, real world problems right from the get-go, really makes a connection to just what an engineer can do, how an engineer can help society, as opposed to just solving pages and pages of really non-contextual problems. So that was one of the things, is just the way we present engineering as just solving these equations, where we would be better serve our students to put those into application. Another aspect of the engineering curriculum is it tends to be very competitive. And I know even at, there's a lot of changes, a lot of colleges are going to more group-based projects, but even in my own department, so we have in our capstone is in computer engineering tech, they made some rovers, hang on. this kind of rover, and they were in teams. And so they had the whole team aspect, but then the culminating experience was a competition of the rovers pitted against each other. And, you know, the research has been around for years that the women would prefer more collaboration. The competition or being the best or being the fastest was not a motivator for them. So some of the other things that I looked at, even in the classroom, so professors would just ask a question and wait for students to respond. And I noticed sitting in the back that often the women or the Alana students would raise their hand and wait patiently, but then some white guy in the front row would yell out an answer and the teacher would snap his head or her head and then start a dialogue with that one student who called out the answer. So even when the professor felt like they were having this classroom that had open discussion, whoever was talking the loudest or talking first gained the attention of the professor in the room. And I saw a lot of the women students would be like this, and then they would just kind of slowly bring their hand down. So those are just a couple examples of things I saw going on in classrooms that really no one was really aware of how those things affected the women and other underrepresented minorities in the room.
Oh, that's really helpful. And I think that sometimes as faculty and teachers, you know, we think that we're being inclusive, and but when you really look at who you're calling on, or, you know, to your point that somebody else just kind of like calls out the answer, that sometimes we, either due to unconscious bias or other reasons, just aren't aware of those things. Are there specific steps that you've taken in your classroom to kind of overcome that, even yourself, to be sure that you're, or you know, things that you've found to be successful in ensuring that everyone does get a voice, and that people, for example, don't shout out the answer but wait for other people to share their ideas?
Yes, so that's something I'm very conscious of now, and I call on students, and if people try to call out, I say, no, I'm waiting for a volunteer. So I'm very careful, but I ask for volunteers because some professors then overcompensate, and the women students said to me, well, I always get called on. So I do ask for volunteers. The other thing I do, we do a lot of group in the courses I teach, many of them are programming based. So I'll present a concept on one day, and then maybe the next day I will have the students work together to write code or to design a solution. And I encourage them to work together rather than trying to solve it alone. So I find that helps a lot. I will see the women who sit together will work together, and it gives them the opportunity to collaborate on a solution. And so it doesn't even have to be a big project, but maybe just a 15-minute coding activity. I encourage them to work together, and that seems to be really effective in including everyone. Another thing, I've worked a lot with teams and team formation. So I did a lot of reading on the research of team formation, and something I do not let my students self-select. And I go by the rule that I don't leave any underrepresented student underrepresented in a group. So, you know, some groups will, because obviously the majority of my students are white males, some groups will end up being all 3 white males. But if I have one woman, I will put 2 women. I typically don't make it a group of all women students, but 2 women and 1 male, or males, Black students I will put together, and that seems to be very effective in students not feeling left out, or more importantly, I don't have women students complaining to me that all they're doing is taking notes, because often there's 2 of them and they take over. So that's a project I've been, not a project, but an initiative I've been working on for student groups and lab groups.
If you have any resources after that you could share and maybe put in the, if you have any handy in the chat box, like research and different things that you've used. I think trying to think about how to create teams is a continuous struggle for people. And I have heard, if anybody uses anything, if they could put that well, I have heard of different types of programs where you can put some information in, and the program itself tries to create diverse teams. So if anyone in the audience has used anything or found a successful way also of creating teams, and you want to share something in the chat box, that would be really great. And before we wrap up and move on, I always like to ask, if somebody in our audience is thinking, oh, this sounds really great and interesting, but I don't even know like how to get started or how to have a conversation in my department. Do you have any advice for people on how to, start small and maybe get buy-in?
Yes. So when I first started my dissertation and I went to my department and I was going to change the whole culture, and I got shot down quicker than you can imagine. The men, my peers, they started questioning the scale on my graph. When I talked about the competition, they said the real world's competitive, suck it up. And I just started too big. So I waited a year and I started very, very small. It helps that my chair has provided a lot of support to me in these efforts, but I picked one thing, and I've already talked about it, but I picked groups. And in talking to my colleagues, and I can't speak for all of your colleagues, but they want evidence. So if you can put up the research on one small thing. So I focused on groups for a year, and I talked about how women students often feel that they're left to be the note taker, they're not allowed to touch the equipment. And so I've have good buy-in from my department, from my colleagues in creating groups and enforcing roles and switching roles. So one of my colleagues has his students each week, they have to have a different role. So everyone touches the equipment and no one's left to be the note taker. So my advice is pick one thing, find the research, support your argument with research, because trying to convince everyone and trying to make sweeping changes, at least for me, I met a lot of resistance, but they are much happier if I could just break off one small piece of it. And then next year, I'm going to start talking about classroom management and question answering and asking and answering in the classroom. So one thing per year.
Yeah, I think that's advice. Just in general, not taking too much on, but yes, like those small wins really seem to be effective and helpful to kind of build a coalition, so to speak.
Yes.
So what we'll do is we'll have Maze is going to talk with us next, and then we will have some time at the end for Q&A. Again, if people want to turn their microphones on and ask questions. In the meantime, also though, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring the chat box, but our panel can also answer questions in the chat as well. So thanks very much, Jean.
Thank you.
Talk with Maze next.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. So, I am going to start by inviting all of us to reflect on. Um, I have two questions that I would like us to reflect on individually, and then I'm going to ask you for feedback. And the first one really is what inclusion means to you. And the second one, which is the one that I would like you to spend more time reflecting on, is reflect on the last time you didn't feel included and why and how you felt. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a minute to just write down your answers to the questions. And I'm also going to put it in the chat. So thank you taking the time to reflect on this. I want to, before I hear your perspective, I want to share with you what one of my students said when I asked her to reflect on these two questions, and especially the second part. We had gone to a conference on STEM education, and when after the conference we met to discuss her experience, she said that she felt that she was unseen, unheard, misunderstood. And what happened is she would introduce herself as student from a community college. She said immediately I was Black from a community college from the South, and immediately she said she felt that she was someone's charity, you know. So they, and so um, so that was her perspective. And from my perspective, I wanted to know what was it about the interaction that she was having with her peers, with my colleagues, that was coming across as she was a charity. And I will dissect this during my presentation here. So I'd like to hear from some of you what you thought about the two questions.
And please feel free to turn your microphone on and share, or if you want, you can also type it into the chat box. Okay, well, I'll jump in and start, and then maybe some other people will follow. I know that when I think of the word inclusion, I usually think of a sense of belonging and seeing other people that look like me or have a similar background or context as me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else? So you can, if you don't feel comfortable and you want to put anything in the chat, please feel free to do so.
Okay, and Robert did put something in the chat box. He said all voices are equally represented and encouraged to participate.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So this is wonderful. So I want to just give a very quick background of where I came from and why this work is so important for me. So I am an immigrant. I was born and raised in Iraq, in Baghdad, Iraq, and I immigrated to the United States after the first Gulf War. And I went to Michigan, I went to the University of Michigan. In graduate school, I transitioned. It was a big transition from undergrad, where I was doing my work in philosophy, to graduate school, where I was in the School of Medicine, doing my work in cellular and clinical neuroscience. So very different, humanities to hard to basic science. And never mind the rigor change, never mind just the culture change, investigating the truth in philosophy versus we're interested in getting data so we could get the next grant, so we could publish, and so on. What happened during the time I was preparing for my comprehensive exam, the 2003 invasion of Iraq happened. And I was, my family was there, my entire family was there. And what I would say, the heartbreak that I was going through was multiplied manyfold when I would go to the lab or when I would study with my students, and no one would say a word. No one would ask me how your family is. No one would even acknowledge that we're at war. And so that put me in a position. I would be walking from the lab to my apartment, and I would entertain the questions: do people not know? Do people not care? Well, if they don't care, do they care about me? If they don't care about me, do they care about the next minority person? And that was exhausting emotionally, to be placed in a position where I have to wonder, do people care? And by extension, do I belong? So fast forward, now I'm teaching at a minority serving institution. We're 45 minutes away from the Mexico border. And we have first generation, we have a lot of minoritized and racialized students. And I began to really view this whole inclusion very differently. And I'll explain why. So I go to conferences and workshops to try to improve my teaching, to help my students. And oftentimes inclusion, at least the way I experienced it, is that it is presented as there is a list and you check the list and you're all good. And it presupposes that way of approaching inclusion presupposes that we're a monolith, right? Science is, students are, and if where in reality for me, I go back to when I was a student, and I experienced, in that case, I experienced a big deal of exclusion by virtue of not being asked, how are you? How is this other big part of you doing? And this was brought, I relived that experience when I was lecturing, and I looked at one of my students, and it just appeared like she wasn't there. And I asked her after class what was going on, and she said, well, my mind is somewhere else. And this is an African American student, and her mind was, it was a week after a shooting of a young Black man. And here I am trying to present about the Krebs cycle or the acid-base physiology. And the reality is, this student wanted me to ask her, how are you doing? Do you feel safe? or when we have DACA students, for example. So I began to look at inclusion as very differently. And yes, all voices are equal, or voices are heard, and people are seen, and also that it's flexible and dynamic and requires this radical approach to inclusion. And so I can be included by not being excluded, or I can be included by deliberately someone goes out of their way to radically understand me to the best as possible as that is, and have this radical hospitality. So my experience in graduate school really shaped the way I interact with my undergraduate students. I never want to put them in a position, the same position that I was in, where I thought, do people care? And I don't treat them the way I want to be treated. I actually want to treat them the way I wanted to be treated when I was the most vulnerable, when I was hitting the ground. How did I want to be treated? And then one last thing I want to add is that one of my teachers often says that in order to be so he teaches medicine and indigenous traditional medicine, and he teaches his students, me, that in order to be a healer, you must begin by forgetting about yourself. And we have ideas of what inclusion is, and those are really good starting points. And I would argue that those are critical starting points. And at the same time, we also have to examine our assumptions about what makes inclusion and turn to the students to hear what they think, how they think they need to be included. And so with that, I'll pause to see if there are any questions.
Again, please feel free to turn on your mic to ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box.
Hi, this is Becky. I was reading the chat box, and it might be interesting for us to kind of like bring out some of the themes that people have typed in, because I definitely think it ties in with what Maze is saying.
Hi, this is Erica. Just going back to sort of connecting what we heard before from Jean and Maze, have you been able to start to have these kinds of conversations with your colleagues? Because I find that to be sort of a challenge in the field, to convince people that no, you do have time probably to talk about your students individually in addition to your course content. It's a challenge, but you know, it really can help engagement. So I just wonder if you have any experience with that.
So I do. As I get older, I care less about what people think about me, and I obviously have more courage and do talk about it. So from my work with my students, I've learned that my science students, my STEM students, they really do care about content and learning. They want to go to medical school and graduate school, and they also want more than the information that we give them. You know, so I did this really big study where I asked students what's missing from your undergraduate STEM education, and they talked about the arts and the humanities and the music, and initially I was just holding on to this information because I would ask my colleagues, you know, do your students want to hear about, you know, the arts and science? And I would get this reflexive reaction like, no, they just want to get a job. And so I held on to it, and it was my student that said, are you going to publish this? it was really pleading with me that those are voices that we want you to share with people. So I started going outside the department, outside of my natural science department, and going to other social science department, for example, to kind of like gain some confidence in how I tell the story and how I advocate for and then you find allies in your department. And I would argue most of my colleagues, if not all, they care about these things, but we are so caught in this, I have so much to cover, I have so much content to cover, this what I call the obsession with rigor. So I don't know if I answered your question. No, yeah.
Just to add on to what Maze was saying, I often run into resistance from my colleagues on rigor because I'll say just let the students work together to solve the problem, and then I'll get pushback and faculty will say, no, 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 they need to each do it alone because they won't learn it. And so those kind of activities that research has shown to be really helpful to some of our underrepresented students, I get pushback on because we all have, not all of us, but there's this belief that STEM has to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jean, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that I was thinking about, and I don't know if anyone can speak to this, but we talk a lot about gateway courses, and that some people view the purpose of those to weed people out. And I'm just wondering, like, what others' thoughts are on gateway courses and how we might reimagine them to, instead of be something that's meant to weed people out, as a way to like bring people in and help help keep them on the pathway.
That's a great question. So I do at a national level work with institutions to look at gateway courses, and I mean, look at the data. Just look at the data, and it is the most our minoritized and racialized students are affected the most in those gateway courses, and intentionally or not intentionally. And so I look at it as, I mean, there are many reasons. Some people say, one of the things that I've been looking at is the way we assess in those courses, and how our assessment is really doesn't allow for it. I question whether our assessment is really measuring learning, or if it's really just measuring a type of students that have learned how to produce the information we want them to produce. And so I have been, and I know a lot of schools, a lot of colleagues in STEM have been looking at, how else can we assess? And so one of my colleagues at Arizona State University, Asao Inoue, who has done a lot of scholarship on anti-racist assessment ecologies, looks at the way we assess in writing, for example, and how we automatically dismiss, or I would say even fail, students who don't write in the typical Eurocentric English, right? And for example, use the vernacular. But when you read their work, it's actually sophisticated, it is critical, it contains depth and breadth. But because the way the rubric is designed and the way we assess, that student is going to fail. And so what Asao has done, he's looked at, well, how else can we assess in a way that is equitable, in a way that doesn't weed these students out? And when I've brought this up in STEM conferences, like I said immediately, well, how does this work in STEM? And I say, well, we're scientists, we're mathematicians, we're engineering, we're all about problem solving. We can surely figure something out that would really, so practically, for example, students in my classes have they have an unlimited time to retake the exam. And it's a lot of work for me because I have to write so many exams, so many versions of the exam. But I really want to encourage this. I haven't learned it fully and I got a C. So let me learn it and I can get a B. And let me learn it even more and get an A. And what I've seen, it reduces the students' stress. We actually measure it. We measure cortisol. We measure their certain physiological, other heart rate, and when they have this opportunity to, they're not going to be caught in a math problem, they relax. It helps their performance. It helps their well-being.
That's great. Thank you. And I know there's a lot of, and I can remember that even myself when I used to teach, the desire to want to allow students to do exactly what you're saying, resubmit assignments, and the difficulty some people, depending on people's load and teaching support and size of class they have, that balance. And, what are ways that we could better support teachers and students so that we can allow them to do more of that resubmitting. All right. Well, thanks so much, Mays. And like I said, we will have more time for Q&A at the end. So now we are going to hear from Sarah next. And Mays, if you could you mentioned the resource about the anti-racist assessment. If you could if you happen to have them handy, if you could put links to any resources in the chat box, that would be great.
Definitely.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, hi everybody. Good morning, afternoon-ish time. I hope lunch is going well for those engaging in that. I'm really excited to be here and to build off of the ideas that Jean and Mays have already put on the table. I think the project that we're going to talk a little bit about now really relates, Jean, to your troubling thinking about partnership. And what does partnership look like for students and how do we build that productively? And then Mays, why is it important to bring student voices forward and student story forward? And thinking about the important role that narrative plays when we think about how we can redesign inclusive education. So I'm Sarah Bunnell. I'm the Associate Director and STEM Specialist at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Amherst College. It's a beautiful, sunny, cold day here in the mountains. And I'm going to talk a little bit. I did prep some slides just because I've got some quotes and some graphs that I wanted to share with you all, and I'm happy to share these forward. So I know they're being recorded, but if there's another way that you can access those that would be useful, do let me know. So I'm going to try to flip my screen here. Okay. How's that look for everybody?
Great.
Okay.
That's great.
Great. Okay. So campus doesn't look like this right now, but it will. So I just want to acknowledge there are a bunch of people who are working on what we call the Being Human in STEM initiative here at Amherst. These are two key leaders on campus. Sheila Jaswal is an associate professor in biochemistry and biophysics, and she founded the Being Human in STEM course, and I'll talk about what that is in just a minute. And then Megan Lister is a co-creator of the HSTEM course. She's in our Center for Community Engagement and thinks a lot about emergent curriculum and partnership. So that's been really, really helpful as we think about what does inclusion look like and how do we partner with students meaningfully to do that. Okay, I'm seeing chat questions here. So if there are other things, I'll go back to that. That's great. Just to give a little bit of context, right, Mays, your point about having a checklist and then being done with it, that was the Amherst problem, which is that Amherst until 1974 was majority white and all male. And our past college president invested heavily in diversifying the student body such that we are now majority non-white, and we are co-ed 50-50 in terms of division. All of our students receive scholarships. It's a need-blind institution, both international and national, so they don't graduate with debt when they leave the college. And so what this has done, sorry, I'm trying to get my slides to go forward, is you see this dramatic shift in terms of the diversification, at least across racial and ethnic lines, and then of course coupled with socioeconomic lines in our student body. And we have faculty who have been teaching students in 1977 who are now teaching students in 2019 and 2020 and are seeing this dramatic shift, which has been incredibly powerful. But what we've seen is that the demographic shifts around diversity have not moved as quickly as the inclusive efforts around pedagogy. And so 4 years ago, there was a 4-day sit-in in the library, which we call the Amherst Protest, a huge student protest and takeover of the library, where marginalized students across a wide range of identities brought forth their stories of marginalization and said, here are all the ways in which I feel like the promise that you made to us about inclusive education is not being fulfilled. Now, excuse me, coming from this or coming out of this, students all wrote letters to their departments, their home departments, major departments, saying, can you work with us? Can you partner with us to think about what pedagogy could look like that could be more inclusive? And every STEM department in particular wrote a letter of support saying, we commit to doing better, and we want to work with you to understand what that would be. So some of the things, and again, I think these are just powerful voices, some of the things that students said in these letters, right? When I'm called to interact with each other, with my peers, I'm always made aware of my Black skin. I'm undocumented and a Latina, and I found it hard to find my voice in small groups among 3 other Caucasian men. I'm forced to make a decision between doing well in my classes and feeling happily part of a community that embraces me for who I am, right? So they're really, as you were saying, Maze, they're carrying this with them into the classroom, beyond the classroom, and within their communities. And so, again, what came out of this was what we call the Being Human in STEM initiative, which was started in spring 2016. And it focuses on the humans behind the science and thinking about the human experience. We wrote an article that came out last year in the AAC New Diversity and Democracy on students as agents of change on campus, if that's useful for folks. And this class takes this model. So what came out of this was partnering with students to develop a course where we engage with academic literature around diversity and inclusion in STEM. Right? So what have been the historical movements? Where do we see issues around the pipeline? What are the issues of exclusion that we're trying to target? What has worked and what hasn't? We do a lot of community building. And then all students develop some action project to enact on campus, either within their own coursework or through campus partnerships and agents, including K through 12. Interventions and programs. So thinking about what kinds of pedagogical initiatives might be helpful in a 5th grade science class and partnering with a local science class to do that. So all of these courses talk a lot about class norms. How do I feel included? What are the times where I felt included? What are the times when I did not feel included? So the model of what we just did is actually part of the building block of thinking about how do I want to create a learning space that feels inclusive for students. And then also drawing, right, Maze, on your really powerful example, is sharing what we call an HSTEM story, your Being Human in STEM story, where all faculty and staff and students who are partners in these classes write their own narrative, right, using this prompt. So what's been the defining characteristics of your STEM experience? right? Thinking about aspects of identity that have contributed to that, thinking about frustration, thinking about overcoming obstacles, thinking about the people and the relationships that have helped you navigate that. And the faculty share this story first. So on the first day of class, we talk about, here's what my pathway has looked like. And what becomes really powerful for students is that our pathways are not linear. And that we have struggled, we have experienced messages of perpetual failure or anticipated failure. And here are the relationships, right, and the internal metrics and characteristics that have helped us move through that. So faculty share their story first and then ask students to write their own story and share anonymously with the class, so that we recognize that first we are humans, and we are humans who are learning science. And as I said, then we all develop action projects that are student-led action projects that come out of each aspect of this, or each version of this course that they enact. And that's become really important, that it's not just engaging with questions about how do I feel included in STEM, but how do I make some movement in my own community and in the experience of other people? How do I feel like I can take this and leverage it? One of the aspects, or one of the things that's come out of that, is an HSTEM course handbook, a pedagogy handbook that students developed that has pedagogical practices that you can embed in all of your STEM courses that are research-based, evidence-based practices that the students compiled and said, here's how you could implement them in our coursework that would make us feel more included. And so that's been really helpful for faculty. One of the things, right, and the question about how do you increase buy-in for colleagues that Erica raised, one of the things that's been really helpful here is providing concrete examples. Here's a little thing that you could do that students recognize is important for them in feeling like they belong in the class. So that has helped folks feel like there's some low-hanging fruit and some ways in which I can engage with this, because I do value it and I want my students to feel included, but I can't envision what that looks like. I'm going to talk, do I have just a second to talk a little bit about outcomes on this?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
So I want to talk just a little bit about what we've seen in the data for how this works. So I saw Anna at University of Cincinnati, Anna Donnell, in the comments. You said you were particularly interested in intro chem. We actually piloted this study in an intro chem course. So in Amherst, the students, when they come in, most of our students, the majority of our students are thinking they're going to be pre-med. They do not all end up pre-med, but we have a very heavy intro chem enrollment. And students are placed in one of two intro chem sections based on their high school math preparation, right? So really at the very beginning being assessed based on, right, privilege and access. So they're placed in one of two lecture sections. And then they're randomly assigned to different lab sections across those two lecture sections. So students are in one of these two lecture components, then they get mixed and they're placed in one of 8 different lab sections. So they're in lab together across preparation. And what we did is we had a subset of these labs that intentionally included the pedagogical practices from the student handbook. The other sections of the lab did not. They were just taught in standard lab form. Come in, do a pre-lab, here's a lecture about what you're going to do, complete the lab, and then complete a lab notebook. So they're all doing the same labs. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happened with the pedagogical practices in a minute. And then we did a pre and a post test of sense of belonging, level of support that they felt, and the likelihood that they'd continue on in STEM. So the HSTEM lab, on the first day, students work heavily to learn each other's names and introduce each other to the class. So getting to know each other as humans. We do the class norming discussion about how will you feel included and a sense that you can learn successfully in this class. And we share those HSTEM stories. And then every week in lab, right, going back, Jeannie, to your point, rotating lab partners, actually using cards with underrepresented scientists, their picture on one side and information about them on the other, and you have to match up the card to find your lab partner. So we use a scientist trading card method for that. Asking students to give community announcements each week about what are they doing in the community that's outside of their STEM coursework that makes them feel whole and engaged, right? So they may be talking about a performance that they're doing, a musical score that they're working on, an artistic installation, going to a friend's performance, whatever it is. We ask them to bring in music or other personally relevant artifacts to share. So it may be music that has cultural relevance to them. It could be an image from home. It could be, right, a poem or something that they've written. And then in their lab work each week, so they're doing the same intro chem labs, but in their lab notebook, they are asked the following prompts. What did I do that helped my lab partner learn this week? What did my lab partner do that helped me learn this week? What do I want to do better to help my lab partner learn next week, right? So that's really building in this metacognitive piece and the emphasis on partnership as a critical component of learning, right? And that we have responsibility in that. And then we ask questions like, how likely are you to take another class in STEM? How do your identities influence your learning in STEM? And what you'll see, sorry, I'm moving, got pictures of your great faces up here. In terms of likelihood of taking another STEM class, this first graph here, right? For folks who had less high school preparation, they were not in the HSTEM lab, there was no change in their likelihood of taking another STEM class. For those who actually came in with more high school math preparation, but no inclusive practices that were explicitly built in, about 10% less likely at the end of class, at the end of the semester, to take another STEM class than they were at the beginning. But then if you look at what happens with the HSTEM lab, we see these positive shifts across both levels of high school preparation in terms of their likelihood of wanting to take more STEM courses in the future. And so our next step is tracking these folks over time. We also asked about identities. And so in students who were not in the HSTEM lab or in students who had more high school preparation, but were in the HSTEM lab, all of those groups said that being female was a negative aspect of their sense of belonging. I feel like I have to prove myself, show I'm a good student and can do well in the class to be taken seriously as a woman. As opposed to the students who actually come in with less math preparation, but are in this inclusive pedagogical lab component, none of them mentioned being female as negative, and instead there was this overarching theme of diversity as contributing to learning. An indicative quote here, the more diverse we are, the more inclusive and comfortable it is. Okay. And then just finally, some reflections from student and faculty about what this meant to them. So one student said, I think my time in HSTEM taught me how powerful candid discussions about personal experiences can be, and not to shy away from talking about uncomfortable topics, right? During these moments of the uprising, we argued about whether we should collaborate with the administration. We were very hesitant to do so. Moving forward, I've adopted a mindset geared towards fruitful collaborations between diverse members of my communities in the hope of enacting change, right? I'm going to jump through that one. And then finally, in terms of faculty, right, one faculty member said, over the years, I had many moments of uncomfortable self-reflection during which I had to grapple with my own privilege and positionality in ways I hadn't before. The impact of this extends far beyond HSTEM and helps me become more reflective and curious. And then finally, this individual said that because of HSTEM, they've made a deliberate decision to share with students stories about their own failures and moments of doubt. I'm a junior faculty member and I'm the only female faculty member in my department in a field where women are underrepresented. Participating in the HSTEM initiative has increased my awareness not only of the importance of inclusivity in my classroom, but also the importance of building a community for myself. So that's all I had to present kind of as an example of one of the ways we've tried to draw on this. and wanted to open it up to questions about how this might resonate with your own context and other approaches that you've used that might be compelling for us to learn from.
Great, thank you. And I'll be monitoring the chat box if anyone wants to put their question in there. Otherwise, we do encourage you to turn your microphone on and ask a question. And just to let people know, we will be sharing this recording out. If you've registered and you're on the listserv, you'll get it through there. And then I usually share it on Twitter, and we use the hashtag STEM Students Thrive. And while we're waiting to see if anyone has questions, just a reminder that our next session will be March 11th, 2020, on a Wednesday, again, 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. And again, that focus will be around the graduate student experience.
Hi, this is Becky. Here at UB, we do have a new department, engineering education. And I think some of the people are on the call today on our meeting. So they might be able to speak to what is happening now. But I know in the past we set up, especially for undergrads, a mentoring relationship. There's like a first year program for students starting in STEM, and it has led to greater amounts of students being able to graduate that are more diverse and seem to be more inclusive. But I know that it was just the beginning stages, which led to their deciding that we needed an engineering education department within the School of Engineering. So if we have any of those folks on call and they want to tell us what they're doing today, that would be great. So I'm not as totally up to date on what the new and great new procedures are. So.
Thanks, Becky. And while we're waiting to see if anyone responds, Maze, if you want to talk a little bit about the large lecture courses.
Sure. With large lecture courses, I mean, one of the things that it's going to be very difficult for you, or even if you have TAs, to get to know all of your students. So this is where I draw on how do we help our students get to know each other and then help them to help us. And so I've created, this is in my classes, I've tried them in bigger classes, and you're welcome to, I can share the documents with you. I've created what's called the Classroom Advocate. And so the Classroom Advocate, this is an example where the class gets to, they get to pick a student or a couple of students, and that student communicates with me information about the class, whether the lecture was too difficult or whether the lecture, and they have immunity, if you will. And so it's anonymous, so I don't get to hear who's, without mentioning any names. And I get to like really learn about what's going on in the classroom. Now, what I've learned over, several times I've done it, is by the middle of the semester, the Classroom Advocate is no longer, they no longer come to me. The students have learned that I'm serious about listening, wanting to know what they think and what they're struggling with. So they start coming to me. And so that's one example. Another example is I give these little extra credits, like 1 point, and where I ask them to tell me about a classmate that you met in this class and tell me, advocate for them, right? And by the middle of the semester, my classes, they learn each other's names. They learn each other's names. They learn important things about each other. And when I read these things, or in your case, when you or the TAs will be reading these things, you learn things that are important. So for example, the students that you think is not participating or is constantly on their phone or whatever, they're actually, English is not their first language, and they're constantly on their phone because they're trying to figure out what you just said. So there are little things that we can do to help with larger classes. And I think it's important to bring in the students, to that.
Thank you. I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything you want to add, or if anyone else has any thoughts, please feel free to jump in and share.
I had one thought with what Maze was saying. I went to lecture on how to do a better PowerPoint, and the person who does it is one of those MVPs for Microsoft, and he points out that you can put at the top of your PowerPoint, you can put on a translation app, and he asks people, well, what language would you like it to be in? And then it can be scrolling across the top. And he usually will stop and ask, well, is it doing a good job? And that sort of thing. So that could be an assistance if, you know, you have a large number of students who are struggling with their English.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
One other thing I would add is we did focus groups last year with our seniors to ask them about, seniors in STEM, to ask them all about what are the things that helped you feel included, what would have made you feel more welcome. And I think for us with a smaller campus community, we're 1,850 students, faculty often assume that students know each other because there's so few of them, they must all know each other. But in fact, they often feel as though they're surrounded by people who they recognize but don't know. And what feels powerful for them is not that they know everyone, but that they know someone. So even small activities like a Think, Pair, Share activity, or helping them through GroupMe to create small study group opportunities, or creating what we're doing now in Intro Bio, which is a study time that will be staffed by some more senior students and faculty, where students can come and just sit and work in community without having to coordinate with other individuals that they may not know. They just know someone else will be there in this space to be in community together with. So thinking about that sense of, if, I'm sure if y'all have traveled, when you're in a new country or a new space where you're surrounded by people but you feel alone. A lot of our students feel that way. And so how do we create those bridge points, even with large classes, so they feel like they have some local community to connect with?
We'll wait a few minutes to see if anyone has any other questions, or if any of our panelists want to pose a question to one another.
Hi, everyone. This is Robin. I work at UB with Becky, who just mentioned the ability for PowerPoint to provide translations in real time. So I had the same gentleman shared the information with me, and I shared a resource on a website that I manage, and so I put that into the chat. But also, I'm looking forward to learning more about the group tool that was mentioned earlier in the chat from Robin, also a Robin who mentioned it. I have it bookmarked, but I can't see it in the chat now. Oh, here it is. Robin Fowler from the University of Michigan shared some software about making groups work better. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about that. But there is also another tool that I'd like to share with everyone, and I will put the information in the chat. It's called Equity Maps. And I have not used it, but I have learned about it, and I'm very interested to have an opportunity. And that, I think, is a way to show if everyone has similar amounts of time in the conversation, and it shows it in a visual way. So those are just a few more tools that might be good for people's toolbox. That's it.
Thank you.
And everyone, I'm saving the chat, but I have a feeling you have the opportunity to do that as well. There's 3 little dots where you can type, and if you click them, it says save the chat, and it saves it to your computer. So you can do it yourself if you wanted to, faster.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And we could also, it does save it when I do the recording, so we could also send it out as an attachment maybe when we send the recording out, if that's useful to people. Or at least maybe we'll curate the links and add them to the email. And I did want to add, there also is a tool called Teachly, Teachly, that was developed here at the Harvard Kennedy School that is supposed to help educators, I think similar to what you mentioned, Robin. It's supposed to help you see whose voice is being heard and not heard and create a more equitable, inclusive classroom. And it's Teachly. There's no E. I can type that in. Okay.
So Patrice, and Becky, I had one kind of meta question that maybe would be helpful for folks to think about. So I was thinking about how you've divided up your different sessions, this one focused on undergrad and then next month on graduate. And so thinking about what are the undergraduate specific aspects of identity or assumed experience that might unite this work and make it different from doing diversity and inclusion work at the graduate level. I wonder if anybody has thoughts about why this population, there might be some specific things that resonate.
That's a great question.
Hi, this is Becky. One thing I know that separates graduates and undergraduates is their level of experience. Their, undergrads a lot of times are leaving home and they haven't had to deal with things on their own. So they are even more feeling isolated. And whereas at a grad level, you've had a little more experience and you've been able to make some connections. So you have a little bit of a base started to give yourself more confidence. So I think that confidence building, and we've seen studies that say that feeling like you're belonging will make people want to persist in STEM more than any other factor. It's not being smart enough, it's not being whatever, it's do you feel like you belong, which then gives you the foundation to continue to do your studies. So.
Yeah, and this may come up when we talk next month, but I know something that I sadly continue to hear from graduate students is the issue of sexual harassment and how the advisor that you have in many cases is an internationally recognized person who can ruin you. And so, a lot of, especially women, are put in these awful positions of having to make really, horrible choices. So I know that continues to be a problem, and I hear a lot of women who talk about dropping out because of that. And I'm involved in a group here in Boston called West Women in the Enterprise of Science and Technology. And I speak to a lot of women who have chosen to leave academia and go more into the, business or private sector, or, move away from being a scientist to business development. And I think, that's something I'm interested in hearing more about, are those stories and why are women leaving academia. And I think some of it is harassment, some of it is work-life balance. I think, to what Becky's point, certainly like sense of belonging. I hear that hear that quite a bit. And I'm wondering if, not in all cases, but in many cases, are some corporations starting to lead the way and do a better job of being very intentional about creating work environments that are more moving from, just thinking about diversity to actually thinking about how can we help create a sense of belonging and inclusion. And maybe some are finally understanding, it's not enough to hire for diversity, but what do we need to do to actually, help those people, support people so that they stay. Okay. Oh, and Erica added a note that many undergraduate students aren't aware of institutional resources that are there to support them. And I think that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, we think a lot, building on that point, Erica, we think a lot about college level capital and the differential preparation that students have in terms of how do I navigate a college level setting? How do I build relationships, but also what are the expectations that are not explicit, but are critical hoops for me to jump through to be successful? So Tony Jack is an Amherst alum. He wrote a book recently. Do y'all know that one, The Privileged Poor? Just came out last year. Not that I'm his book rep or anything, but it's very good. And one of the things that he talks a lot about are office hours. That he knew when office hours were, but he didn't know what the heck office hours were. And that's a critical place where students build a sense of community and belonging and inclusion in a discipline, and build relationships with advisors and faculty. And so what are the things that we're doing that are creating unnecessary barriers for students who don't know about these resources, but we assume that they should? And where can we be more explicit to break down some of those barriers of knowledge for being successful?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've heard that, I don't know if the example is from that book, but I remember hearing somewhere somebody saying that like they thought office hours meant like that was when the faculty was in their office.
Right. Don't busy me. Right.
But I think I was at a presentation. I can't remember who the presenter was, but they were doing research around underrepresented minorities and specifically like first gen as graduate students, and talking about how there's this sense that like, oh, like if they've made it to grad school, they're good to go. And we forget that, a first generation in grad school doesn't have a lot of that cultural capital that you're talking about. And we really need to remind faculty and, student support services that there still is a huge need, even in graduate school. And I see that, especially at some of the, schools where, it's, competitive to get in. There is definitely that sense that, well, like if they were able to get in here, they must be able to navigate. And also to say that it's, we also like, yes, they may be able to figure out how to navigate, but do we really want them spending all their time trying to figure those things out and being stressed? And how can we better support them so they can focus on the learning that we want them to be doing?
Right.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and especially our panelists for a really great discussion. And as soon as I have the recording uploaded to YouTube, we will definitely share it via the listserv as well as on social media. And please mark your calendars for March 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for our discussion on graduate students. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And Patrice, before we go, I just want to give a plug for the annual UB Women in STEM Summit. I know many of you are not close by Buffalo, but many are. So I just added one more link into the chat. On March 4th, the UB Women in STEM Collaborative Group is having the annual summit, and it promises to have many other great conversations like the one we just had today. So,
Oh, that's
see
great.
some of you there.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks. Thank you all very much for the conversation.
Thank you, everyone.